United States and South Korea reach a nuclear deterrence agreement. Two leaders reach an agreement at the Washington NATO Summit. Russia and North Korea have been cooperating in more material ways since the start of the Ukraine war, as Russia needs additional munitions to support its Ukraine war efforts. North Korea has been willing to fill a gap by providing Russia with up to 1 million artillery rounds and an unspecified number of ballistic missiles. In June 2024, President Vladimir Putin arrived in Pyongyang for a state visit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The two leaders signed a defense and security agreement, and the North Koreans agreed to send up to 4 Army engineering brigades to occupied Ukraine. The agreement between the two countries has become a critical area of concern for South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, who stated that the agreement would require South Korea to consider increasing its support for Ukraine's need for lethal aid. The NATO Summit in Washington, D.C. from July 9th to the 11th, 2024, will discuss the issue of North Korean-Russian cooperation due to South Korea's concerns. Russia's need to procure weaponry and ammunition from North Korea and Iran demonstrates its military strain during the war with Ukraine. President Putin was able to obtain material support from North Korea, but what he offered in return was much less tangible. Re-signing a defense treaty from the Soviet era, which mandates mutual support in war, raises the question whether Ukraine's attack on Russian targets within Russia, particularly with weapons from the West, could serve as a legitimate justification for North Korea to dispatch additional troops beyond the 4 engineering brigades. We anticipate that Russia will use its position in the United Nations Security Council to obstruct the imposition of new UN sanctions against North Korea and prevent the renewal of current sanctions. President Putin did offer to provide advanced Russian weapons to North Korea, saying that North Korea are free to use these weapons just as Ukraine is free to use the weapons donated by the West against targets within the Russian border. This is concerning for South Korea, as more capable weapons will be in the hands of the North Koreans and impact South Korea's security. Russia, on the other hand, is at war under sanctions and needs missiles, drones, and artillery rounds from its allies. It is doubtful that Russia can provide North Korea with anything other than token material support for new weapon systems. For South Korea and Japan, it is the Russian technology and intellectual transfers that are more concerning. The North Koreans have created a nuclear weapons program and are expanding warhead production. The North Koreans are also primarily have a domestically created rocket and missile program, which has successfully developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of reaching the entire United States, as well as place satellites in orbit. Russian assistance in these areas is most useful to North Korea, which has become a more significant threat to Japan, the United States, and South Korea. North Korea can overcome the challenges of transitioning to solid rocket-fueled missiles for first-strike capability, miniaturizing warheads for mounting on missiles, perfecting warhead guidance and reentry, and developing submarine-launched nuclear ballistic missiles with Russian aid. The concern is that once North Korea has this capability, it will press for concessions from the region and the world, and will have the ability to strike the U.S. mainland, which means that none of North Korea's adversaries will be safe from its demands. Russia has been silent on what it will provide to North Korea. So much of it is speculation, but it is known that North Korea is not in a financial position to offer support without something in return that benefits it. Other than energy and weapons expertise, the Russians have little tangible to offer to North Korea. This is where this concern arises. The worst case scenario of Russian support for North Korea is that it could soon face threat from North Korea, which possesses nuclear weapons which can be delivered anywhere in the Korean Peninsula with nearly no warning and no significant defense options for an attack specifically targeting South Korea. The South Korean president has been pressing the U.S. to respond to the potential North Korean threat with a nuclear umbrella and a clear declaration that the U.S. will launch a nuclear attack on North Korea if it uses nuclear weapons against it. It was important that the South Koreans wanted an unambiguous statement from the U.S. on what would happen to North Korea in the event of a nuclear attack. South Korea is part of the Indo-Pacific 4 IP4 NATO Partnership Program, which is attempting to establish closer ties with like-minded rule-based countries in Asia. This meant that the South Korean president would be attending the Washington NATO Summit, and Russian assistance was a top agenda item for South Korea. On the sidelines of the meeting, President Biden and President Yoon Suk-yeol met and reached an agreement that partially satisfied South Korea. After the sideline meeting, the United States published a joint statement promising a swift, overwhelming, and decisive response, including a nuclear response should North Korea launch a nuclear attack on South Korea, thereby leading to the end of the North Korean regime. The U.S.'s response was similar to previous statements on the question, but strategic ambiguity would prevent it from stating what it would do precisely. Although the two nations have not released the details of their agreement, it is believed that the United States and South Korea will establish procedures for integrating U.S. nuclear capability and deterrence as part of South Korea's defense. We anticipate the reintroduction of U.S. nuclear weapons into the Korean Peninsula after their removal in 1991. As a deterrent for South Korea, the U.S. will likely deploy weapons in South Korea and elsewhere in the region. It is also expected that the U.S. will make publicized visits to South Korea by nuclear-armed ships and aircraft in a show of deterrence as well. The two countries are still working out the details, and they don't expect to release many of them to the public. There are a few instructive items from the agreement, and general security situation on the Korean Peninsula contain a few instructive points. The first is that despite the Chinese Foreign Ministry's fear-mongering about statements of NATO's attempts to expand in Asia, NATO was unable to provide any tangible assistance to South Korea except for the offer of joint naval patrols and exercises. China was not included in Russia's agreement with North Korea, which was based on a Soviet agreement signed during the period when China and the Soviet Union were geopolitical rivals. The final point is that it appears to be an effort by the U.S. to not only strengthen its new nuclear cooperative agreement with Japan and South Korea, but also dissuade nuclear proliferation in the region, primarily from Japan and South Korea. To assure South Korea that North Korea would not abandon it in the event of a nuclear attack against the U.S. mainland, the U.S. and South Korea needed a solid agreement in case of a nuclear attack. The North Korean quest to become a recognized nuclear power began well before the start of the Ukraine war. As much of it sounds like a broken record, the start of the Ukraine war and the international action-reaction cycle over the war have changed the status quo in the world security order. It also highlights the failure of both sides' early war aims, which were based on regime change and did not prioritize the early negotiated end to the war. A European war has now impacted the security situation on the Korean Peninsula, and it is guaranteed that this was not on any side's agenda in February 2022.